From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Republican presidential candidates held their first debate Wednesday night in Milwaukee with 8 candidates on stage, but one big absence, Donald Trump, former president, choosing to do an interview with Tucker Carlson instead on Twitter. But the 8 candidates will be our focus today as they held a spirited back and forth, and we'll talk about what we heard and what it means for the race for the White House going forward. Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with 2 of my political gurus, Kyle Peterson and Kim Strassel. Welcome. First of all, my own view, overall view, was a good debate. I think they benefited from the fact that Donald Trump wasn't there, and that if he had been there, he would have dominated the debate, and the discussion would have been all about him. There was some discussion about Trump, but there was more on the issues, and I heard give a chance for the other candidates to showcase who they are, some of their biography, and also what they want to stress as campaign themes. Kim, what's your first impression? Who did well? Who helped himself or herself the most?
Well, I totally agree with you that this was a good debate, in part by the absence of Trump. This was the first time that many Republican voters, or voters in general, are going to get to see these candidates outside of the shadow of Trump, who has so dominated the news cycles. And in that regard, I thought that it was a pretty interesting night. Ron DeSantis was the guy to beat going in. I thought he held his own in part because it turns out that actually everybody instead felt like beating up on the guy who's recently had a little boomlet in the polls, Vivek Ramaswamy. He really was the one who took a lot of incoming. We can talk about that a bit. But in terms of Ron DeSantis, I think he made his case about Florida in his leadership there. He was very focused on talking about the future, not the past, and not talking about Donald Trump. You saw a very single-minded focus on that. I think he ducked and dodged a few questions, but I just noted that I think he escaped a little bit more unscathed than I might have thought. But I think the people who instead made a little bit of a showing last night will make people take notice. Nikki Haley, I thought, had a really good night. Mike Pence, I thought, had a really good night. So I think that there was a couple of people who broke out in a way. I think that there are some folks that held their own. That was Ron DeSantis. And I think that there are some people who may have done themselves some damage, and that would include Vivek Ramaswamy.
Kyle, give us your quick overview.
Well, I agree with that. I think it was a spirited debate. We saw a choice that voters are going to be presented in these Republican primaries on foreign policy, on views of the federal government's role in abortion policy. I think the question, though, is whether this ultimately sort of ends up playing into President Trump's hands, because
is the election already over, Kyle?
No, but it could have a dispersing effect. The number 2 and 3 guys in the polls have been Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy. I think that they both showed off some of their weaknesses during the debate. And so you may see some of that vote shifting to these other candidates. Nikki Haley, I think, outshined her fellow South Carolinian Tim Scott. Nikki Haley may give a boost. I agree with Kim that I think Mike Pence did pretty well. People may be remembering that he's been at this a long time, not only a former office holder, but a former talk show host, pretty good up on the stage. And then if you've never heard of a guy like Doug Burgum before, you may think that seems like a normal guy, smart guy, has some ideas, has the pocket constitution, may get him over the hump to get into that second debate. And so who is going to drop out of this thing?
Sounds to me, Kyle, like you think Donald Trump's the winner in this debate. I'm not sure that that's right. I mean, you're right. It could happen that way, that it's all been dispersed. But this is the first chance Republicans really had to see some of these people. And who knows if one of them might actually get people's attention, because remember, the votes are still, 4.5 months away in Iowa. The mainstream press wants to anoint Trump already. And of course, Trump wants to anoint Trump already. But I think that's all premature. We want to see who can break out here. And that's what the debate was really all about. So let's listen to Mike Pence talk about his qualifications and then talk about Vivek Ramaswamy.
I was a House conservative leader before it was cool. I actually pushed a Deficit Reduction Act. That was the last time we actually reduced the national debt in the United States, when I was the leader of House conservatives. I balanced budgets and cut taxes when I was governor. I mean, look, Joe Biden has weakened this country at home and abroad. Now is not the time for on-the-job training. We don't need to bring in a rookie. We don't need to bring in people without experience.
And let's listen now to Vivek Ramaswamy.
Let us be honest as Republicans. I'm the only person on the stage who isn't bought and paid for, so I can say this. The climate change agenda is a hoax. The climate change agenda is a hoax. And we have to declare independence for it. And the reality is, the anti-carbon agenda is the wet blanket on our economy.
And Chris Christie responding to Mr. Ramaswamy.
I've had enough already tonight of a guy who sounds like ChatGPT standing up here. And the last person in one of these debates, Brett, who stood in the middle of the stage and said, "What's a skinny guy with an odd last name doing up here?" was Barack Obama. And I'm afraid we're dealing with the same type of amateur standing on stage tonight.
Come over and give me a hug. Give me a hug just like you did to Obama.
The same type of amateur.
And you'll help elect me just like you did to Obama, too. Give me that
the
bear
same
hug, brother.
type of amateur.
Hold on.
Well, that was fun. Pence and Christie going after Mr. Ramaswamy, who really was, Kim, as you suggested, the center of attention. And that, I guess, is a credit to him and shows how much progress he's made as a candidate coming really from nowhere, a young entrepreneur, 38 years old. Talked a fair bit about generational change. I think the freshness of his voice, he's got a certain optimism and buoyancy, energy. But what do you make of this line? So I'm the only one up here who's not bought and paid for. And he also took a nasty shot at Nikki Haley, suggesting she's on the board of Lockheed Martin and Boeing, which she fought back on. What do you make of the overall performance of Vivek? Do you think he helped himself?
Well, here's the thing about Ramaswamy. I can see the attraction, and I can see why he's been rising in the polls. He's young. He's vivacious, as you say. He normally presents with a pretty sunny optimism about the country, talks a lot about American national identity and the need to get it back. He also is very bold, especially in a lot of his domestic proposals, which Republican voters are eager to hear. You know, this is a guy who's like, I'm going to get rid of the Department of Education, whole cloth. I'm going to take on the federal bureaucracy. That's great. I think he nonetheless made two big mistakes on the stage last night. One of them was these almost canned lines. And I think that that's an important aspect, that it undermined a little bit the question of his authenticity. He seemed to have a couple of pre-prepared hits on other folks that marked him out as the only genuine person. But in fact, in making them, he looked a little less genuine. He looked like the classic politician who prepared for the debate with these kind of slaps, which were also unfair. And I think it made him come across a little smarmy at times, a little supercilious. But I think the other mistake he made is, look, whenever a candidate goes, and especially if they don't have a lot of experience, the voters want to know that they can handle the job, especially the biggest job of the president, which is protecting the country and national defense. And I think a lot of his answers up there on his saying that he would cut off funding for Ukraine, his worldview in terms of Russia and China, it really struck, I think, a little bit as inexperienced. And that's why those criticisms by Mike Pence and Nikki Haley landed hard, because they had an element of truth to them.
Kyle, let's listen to a clip of Nikki Haley and Mr. Ramaswamy in their exchange on Ukraine.
Look at what Putin did today. He killed Prigozhin. When I was at the UN, the Russian ambassador suddenly died. This guy is a murderer, and you are choosing a murderer over a American country.
Because Mr. DeSantis,
Nikki, I wish you well in your future career on the boards of Lockheed and Raytheon.
You know, I'm not on the boards of Lockheed and Raytheon. And you know,
Boeing came off of it, but you've been pushing this lie. You've been pushing this lie all week, Nikki.
You want to go and defund Israel? You want to
okay, let me address that. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to address each of those right now. This is the false lies of a professional politician. There you have it.
Your watch, so the reality is, America less safe. You have no foreign policy experience, and it shows.
And you know what?
Kyle, my view of that exchange is that, and overall on foreign policy, Haley won that hands down. Vivek Ramaswamy is taking this Trump view of Ukraine. He wants to withdraw U.S. support. He says it's not in America's national interest. He basically, he's using the line, I think he did last night, I've certainly heard it before, that we have to take care of our southern border versus the Ukrainian border with Russia, as if we have to do one or the other and you can't do both. What did you make of Ramaswamy on foreign policy?
I tend to agree with you. It strikes me as another example of his weakness, which is that he's this wonderkind who has these slogans that he's figured out that resonate with a certain segment of the electorate, but don't seem all that well thought out. I mean, this one in particular is his plan for world peace, which is to let America's enemies do whatever they want, basically. Let Russia take Ukraine, let China take Taiwan.
But only after 2028.
Right. We'll give Israel another 4 years of funding to get up on its own 2 feet, he said, and then they can stand on their own in the Middle East, as if the United States doesn't have any interests in Israel or in the Middle East. And with regard to Ukraine, I mean, the linkage of that with the southern border I find particularly odd, because the main thing that the U.S. is sending to Ukraine is weaponry like anti-tank Javelin missiles. And I don't understand. I would like to see his plan for what he's going to do with those Javelin missiles if we keep them here in order to secure the southern border. And I think that just goes to his general weakness, which is he seems like a slogan candidate, throwing out things like this world peace plan. One of the things he threw in edgewise was that he's going to abolish the FBI. And I understand that the FBI could use some reform, but it also does a lot of real law enforcement functions. It's the prime law enforcement agency on Native American reservations. Interstate crime, if you have a serial killer that's operating in a handful of states, the FBI is definitely involved in stuff like that. Is his plan to just quit enforcing federal law, or is he going to abolish the FBI and then the next day set up the BFI or the IBF in order to do the same sort of things? It honestly seems like he just hasn't thought about it that well beyond the 6-word slogan that he's going to throw out as an applause line.
Abolish the FBI strikes me as about as winning a political line as defund the police.